I'm doing any kind of like isometric work or any kind of movement-based work, I typically have a lot of intention through my eyes in a target. And I'm typically putting an awful lot of importance on how the hands are distributing load through the limb and how the feet are distributing load through the lower body as well. Because it's just how we interact with the world as humans. And then the midline of the body should be subconscious in its control. I shouldn't have to think about bracing my core when I reach outside of my base of support. That should be subconscious. And my intention, my conscious intention should be through my limbs, my hands, my feet, and my eyes to allow that.
Doing all of that stuff at the same time, like you see with LeBron, like catching balls with flashing glasses on a Bocey ball, it's just not specific at all to any sensory system, right? One of the things that we try to do, especially with ICANN, like Ryan was just talking about, be specific with your assessments. Know what part of the vestibular system is going to activate the posterior chain and attack that with your neural priming drills.
That was Dr. Ryan Foley and Dr. Kyle Paxton. I'm your host, Joel Smith, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. For episode 175, the theme is neurological training and performance. Ryan Foley and Kyle Paxton together run the business Integrated Kinetic Neurology, which is a resource for therapists, coaches, and trainers on neurological training systems. Dr. Foley and Dr. Paxton both have the common thread of being dissatisfied with the traditional rehab and performance routes and found much better results upon going into a neurological model. So neurology. I always loved learning about the role of the nervous system in training. As Kyle mentions early in the show, when you really think about it, everything is neurology. We read books like Super Training and high-level resources like that, and one of the common threads is the nervous system is king. It is the controller of everything. What I really love about these two is they've taken the science of it and made it something that's not just a series of interventions, but also something that you can see show up in any athlete, watching any athlete perform. For example, looking at their eyes and their hands and how that all connects, and their feet, and how that all connects into the skill trying to be performed. For the show today, Ryan and Kyle are going to get really into the primary sensory systems that contribute to human movement and performance and why they matter. And whether you're a coach, trainer, therapist, these are things that all are at the core of human performance. So within those three systems, we're talking proprioceptive system, visual system, and vestibular system. And on the show, Ryan and Kyle are going to get into practical, not only ways to observe this in action, but also training interventions and ideas and philosophies that anyone can use, and just to get a new layer of understanding of what you're doing. Along the lines of Dan Fichter, I always love talking neurology and performance. It's absolutely an important direction that this field is going. So with that all being said, let's get on to the show with Dr. Ryan Foley and Dr. Kyle Paxton. Hey guys, thanks for being on the show today. Really appreciate it. I'm excited to get a show on neurology. I've had some great talks with people like Dan Fichter, and I'm excited to talk to you guys today. So could we start off by you guys sharing briefly who you are and what led you into this path of neurology in your practice?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Kyle Paxton. I got my bachelor's in exercise science up at SUNY Brockport in New York, and then went on and got my doctorate of physical therapy from Nazareth College, all up in Rochester, which is why it's funny when we talk about Dan Fichter, very close colleague of mine. I credit a lot of me getting into this world to him. And the reason I got into this neurology space is because when you really think about it, everything is neurology. The thing I talk about a lot is people like to talk about orthopedics, but you can't truly understand orthopedics without understanding neurology. And as I got into more practice and started working with more clients and athletes, that really started to become clear to me. So I took a deep dive into that world, and we've kind of been pushing forward ever since then. And we created Integrated Kinetic Neurology to try to take that complicated world that is neuroscience and make it really, really practical.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks for having us, Joel. I'm in the same boat as Kyle. I graduated with Kyle, and after I graduated, I moved into New York City. I was working with a lot of clients down actually the Wall Street. I was working in a little physiotherapy practice down there, and I was using all the tools, all the treatment methods I learned in school. Wasn't really getting anywhere, and that's what kind of triggered me to go down the path of looking at different systems because I think in school we all learn how to assess and treat the low tolerance of certain peripheral tissues like your muscles and joints. But I think we forget to consider that the brain relies on more than just muscles and joints to actually experience the world. Again, the brain's in that little black cave, and the only way it has access to the outside world is through the sensory systems. And so we took a shift to looking at the body from, okay, can each sensory system actually experience load well? Can it tolerate load well in a clinical environment, which is much different to the complex, chaotic environment in the real world, and especially when you get out into a sporting situation where you don't have time to necessarily listen and interpret the feedback from your muscles and joints. There has to be good predictive capacity there to be able to perform well. So my background after school, I went and I took a course called Proprioceptive Deep Tendon Reflex. It's kind of a mouthful, but it was a course that looks at how the unique individual responds to different kinds of sensory input. And we forget that each individual is completely unique, with a completely different, unique past history, past experiences, past medical history, injury history. And we have to understand that all these things play a massive part in how they respond to our load, essentially, to our input, to exercise interventions, be it in a rehab setting or performance setting. So that's what we really want to get across, is that there's other systems there at play that influence how your muscles and joints interact with the world.
Yeah, Ryan, so you mentioned sensory systems, and I know a big part of what you do with the neurology revolves around that. And the first question I wanted to ask you guys was, what are the primary sensory systems that contribute to human movement, and why do they matter? Shoot, that question could probably be like an hour topic, I'm sure. Yes. But from a very basic perspective, just to kind of get us started, can you talk a little bit about those sensory systems and their contribution to human movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, sensory feedback, both from an internal perspective and an external perspective, is what drives our ability to respond to the world around us. And we want to step back and understand, can each sensory system actually do its job well in transmitting information to the brain? Because, again, every stimulus to our system has to be transduced into a nerve impulse so our brain can actually make sense of it. And so the majority of the sensory input that goes to our nervous system is made up of the information that goes through our proprioceptive system, our muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments, but also through our visual system and our vestibular system. And so, like I said before, we spend an awful lot of time looking at the low capacity of the muscles and joints, but an awful lot of the manner in which our muscles and joints interact with the world is heavily dependent on how the visual system and the vestibular system is actually communicating with the proprioceptive system. And it's something that we don't even think about until a problem arises in those systems. And so when we think about the vestibular system, for example, it's worth noting that on a survival level, some of these systems matter more than others. And so when you think about the vestibular system, the main job of my vestibular system, which is located in my inner ear, its job is to turn head movement or head acceleration into language that my brain can actually make sense of. Right, so my brain can get an idea of how orientated I am with gravity, and also with the rest of my body as well. And so I'm sure a lot of your listeners out there have worked with athletes that have experienced concussion, but also people who work with like clients in pain or any kind of other stress-related or pain-related condition that may have come across people with vestibular issues like vertigo or other dizziness. And you have to kind of ask yourself, how well do you move, or how coordinated is your movement when you have a vestibular disruption? When your vestibular system is affected, your movement coordination goes to sleep again. It's very, very difficult to move. And so it tells you how important the vestibular low capacity is in driving the proprioceptive system as well. And there's many different reflexes that connect our vestibular system to our eyes and our vestibular system to our body. And one of the fastest reflex pathways in the body is your vestibular spinal reflex. And so when my head moves, there's typically going to be a reflexive connection between that head movement and my body through the vestibular spinal reflex, which connects the inner ear to a lot of the muscles around my midline, my trunk, but also through my extremities as well. So let's say, for example, when I'm jumping off a box, I can't just rely on the feedback from the length of my muscles, the position of my joints, but my brain needs to pick up that information about the acceleration of my head. So if my brain perceives my head going straight up and then dropping down to the floor, it's going to say, hey, I'm moving down. at a fairly fast pace. So that one of the ways the vestibular system is going to help us adapt to that collision against the ground is to increase the amount of tone that we hold in our muscles. So it's kind of a feed-forward type of mechanism to help prepare us for how we respond to the landing. Right, and particularly it's going to connect with the anti-gravity muscles, the extensor muscles. So it's the vestibular system allows us, it aids our proprioceptive system in adapting to movement and being able to be efficient with our movement. And the same thing with the visual system as well, in that we need to have good peripheral awareness when we're running and we're participating in high intensity movements, because we need to know what's going on around us so we can react to unexpected perturbations. Like if I'm a soccer player and I'm running up the field, if I haven't got good peripheral awareness and I don't see someone running at me to my left, if I catch them too late, I'm not going to be able to kind of set that tone in my body to be able to react and be more efficient with my movement coordination. But also in the same way, I need to be able to stabilize my eyes on targets when I move as well, because being able to stabilize my gaze on targets as I move reduces an awful lot of noise in the nervous system, but it also allows me to drive a lot of intention, maximum intention through movement. And that intention behind movement is so important because it allows a structure in our brain called our cerebellum to be able to compare what's actually happening with our movement versus what I intended to do. So it allows that coordination to occur on much more of an effective level to be able to adapt to unexpected perturbations, right? And so it's really kind of a nice symphony of vestibular system functioning, understanding how it's loading, visual system and the proprioceptive system. And you can kind of break all those systems up into subcomponents as well and really ensure that every system is well able to tolerate load. And then you can start to kind of add more noise and more variables to really take an athlete to the next level, but also help people with any kind of pain-related problems as well. So hopefully that wasn't too neuroscience-y.
Yeah, no, that was a great summary. Shoot, it probably clocked in at what probably could have been an hour plus presentation of the whole course, but it's clocked in probably still under 5 minutes. So that was awesome.
Cool.
One of the things I wanted to follow up, or Kyle, did you have any to add on to that before I added a question in there?
Well, no. Well, I think we'll find out quickly here. I tend to be the summary guy when we're on podcasts together, but I think that the main thing that we want people to take away is understanding that speed, power, strength is not just all about the muscles and tendons and the joints, right? And when you can start to say, okay, I need to make this athlete faster on the field, maybe it's not just about adding more load on the bar and making them stronger so they can create a greater ground reaction force. Maybe it's if we improve that peripheral vision of the athlete, then they can react quicker and utilize that potential force that they have. We talk a lot about expression of force versus the potential force, right? And the sensory systems allow you to fully utilize the actual structure that you have. And that's where we start to bridge the neuro-orthopedic performance side of things when you can look at it through that lens. And I think that's an important takeaway. But like Ryan said, I think if you can start to understand that the proprioceptive system, the vestibular system, and the visual system are the primary drivers of how our body can respond to the outside world, it can really start to change the lens that you look at your programming through, that you look at how athletes move through, and it can open up a lot of new windows.
One of the things I always think about every time this topic is brought up, and I've mentioned this to Dan in the past as well, is the idea, and everyone will always say this, in the world of jumping or jumping height, pretty much everyone jumps the highest after they play a game of pickup basketball. And there's no warm-up that anyone can do that can recreate that. In the sense of I could quantify the work that gets done in that situation, but I'm not going to get up as high as I can. And I think about everything in that game from a sensory perspective and as well as emotional. Ryan, you mentioned the emotions in motor output, because the emotions of a game are different than the emotions of training by yourself or even just training and there's no competition. And so I enjoy thinking about that. One of the things that even outside of competition, I liked, Ryan, that you mentioned the idea of the eyes and intention, like eye movements and intention. I've never heard that before, but it does make sense. And I know intention is talked a lot about in the world of neurology as well and how important that is. Would you guys mind expanding briefly a little bit on that topic of eyes and intentionality?
Yeah. I love talking about the neuroscience behind intention, because it's such an important thing to understand in reference to sporting performance and even chronic pain, but also in how different parts of our body are actually organized in terms of how they're controlled in real world environments. So when I think of like the midline versus the limbs, for example, there's a lot more purposeful control and intentional control required to control my limbs in the real world, versus my midline, which is more kind of subcortical and reflexive in its movement control.
That's like the core, right? The midline being like the core or the trunk. Okay, just making sure.
The core of the body. Yeah. And so like you can't consciously, or you can't intend to move or to fire your multifidi muscles between like L4, L5. You know, it's very difficult to have like conscious intentional pathways. You just don't have them in your body. And so when you think about intention or motivation to move, typically our intention to move is driven by a part of the brain called our limbic system, which generates motivations, right? So typically when I see something, again, I'm going to generate an intention to achieve some kind of future state with, let's say if I'm picking up a pencil, I'm generating a future state or that I want to achieve with that pencil in my hand, let's say. And so that limbic system communicates with the part of the brain called your frontal cortex, which houses your motor cortex, where we generate motor output through. And so the frontal cortex gets that information, and the frontal cortex really generates very unspecific motor output. Okay, so like a lot of this functional neurology, kind of these concepts come from people who have had pathological neurological issues. Like if you have a cortex stroke, like a pathological stroke, again, you'll typically lose movement somewhere, especially in the frontal cortex. Versus if you have an issue with your cerebellum, you'll typically still have movement, but you'll have very poor control of that movement. And so when the frontal cortex gets that information from the limbic system, it has to communicate with the cerebellum. And so let's say if I want to reach out with my right hand, my left frontal cortex will typically initiate that movement, and I'll talk to the same side cerebellum, which kind of it's obviously much more complex than this, but it kind of stores a lot of your movement experiences, right? And so the frontal cortex says, "Hey, cerebellum, what's the best way to carry out this task?" And the cerebellum says, "Hey, this is the best way to do it. Let's do it this way." And then the frontal cortex generates the actual motor output, but with the help of the cerebellum. And so I still have that intention now in my mind because I have that motivation behind the movement, and that allows my cerebellum to then compare what's actually happening to the intention behind that movement. And that's why the intention is so crucial. But when we think about how most of us generate intention through the real world, with real world movement, it's typically through our eyes, through our hands, and through our feet. Right, so I intend to reach out for something with my hands. I interact with the world through my feet. Like, I haven't seen anyone running down a field yet on their knees or their hips. And so it's a lot about how you interact, how forces interact with your feet, and how that force dissipates up through the chain. And same thing with the hands, how the hands kind of collect and accept force from the external environment and dissipate and kind of accept that load and transmit that load up through the chain. And the eyes allow us to kind of maintain that smooth coordination through our hands and through our feet. So whenever I'm doing any kind of like isometric work or any kind of movement-based work, I typically have a lot of intention through my eyes and a target, and I'm typically putting an awful lot of importance on how the hands are distributing load through the limb and how the feet are distributing load through the lower body as well. Because it's just how we interact with the world as humans, and then the midline of the body should be subconscious in its control. I shouldn't have to think about bracing my core when I reach outside of my base of support. That should be subconscious, and my intention, my conscious intention, should be through my limbs, my hands, my feet, and my eyes to allow that motion to occur. Because I think a lot of us have kind of been taught that or come across that example of like when you put your hands in the kind of the base of your neck, right beneath the occiput, and you kind of move your eyes left and right, you can kind of feel that change in tone. Right, so if you get the pads of your fingers right now and you gently place them right beneath the occiput, right in the suboccipitals, don't press too hard, but keep your head nice and still, and then move your eyes left and right, and you might see or feel a little flutter of tonal change, left and right.
Interesting. Right? I'm doing it right now.
You're feeling that change in tone in the suboccipital muscles, because when you move your eyes, it generates an intention to the brain that you're about to move in a certain direction. Okay, and so that's the whole importance of, or it kind of adds to the importance of keeping your gaze nice and stable and controlled during movement, because it allows for less noise, less chatter in my nervous system when I'm actually carrying out coordinated movements. Whereas if my eyes are constantly moving left, right, and center, my brain's constantly getting this feedback through a spinal or a neurological pathway called your tectospinal tract, which takes visual information and changes the tone of your body to get ready for movement. So I don't want a lot of like noise in my nervous system when I'm trying to, from a rehab standpoint, trying to move, or even when I'm an athlete trying to move in a certain direction in a sport or in a certain direction in the gym. I want my eyes to be stable, to reduce the amount of noise and chatter in my brain, so I can really focus on that directional output through my hands, through my feet, and of course through the eyes.
I really like that in terms of the hands especially. I know Adarian Barr was the first person to point out to me that you can see what someone's feet are trying to do by watching their hands. And you'll see, and then all of a sudden I'm watching these track meets and I'll see different athletes, be it jumpers or sprinters, with different hand alignments. Like their fingers are in these crazy, some of them have a Spock hand. Some of them are like crossing the, like where you're crossing, let's say I'm looking at my hand now, the second and third fingers together over each other, or the pinky finger will be out, because it's always trying to mirror what the foot's trying to do. So I had kind of I'd thought about that in my head before, but I've never thought about the role of the eyes in the intentionality. So it's a really cool trifecta. And I know also the core, being reflexive, like you can't think about what your trunk or your core or midline is doing and do anything athletically effectively for the most part. It just, you'll be really
in trouble
slow.
if you're worried about what your midline is doing when you're reaching out, or with your hands, you're reaching with your feet to try and accept stress from gravitational forces and even unexpected forces,
Yeah, that's why the brace the core during any movement, like cue, is always kind of always been an interesting one to me. I've never found that to be an effective strategy. I guess unless you're getting punched in the stomach, but maybe that would be a different neurological signal. I don't know.
Yeah, it kind of adds to, like, people talk about like, especially in rehab, people talk a lot about proximal stability before distal mobility, but it shouldn't be conscious proximal stability. It should be subconscious proximal control. Like, you shouldn't be aware of that. Your vestibular system, your visual system should be communicating that change in tone through your midline. So that just operates on its own, so that we can have the resources then to move intentionally through our hands to interact with the world, and through our feet to interact with the world. So it's just about being able to understand that, and then stepping back and changing your assessment and changing your interventions from both a rehab standpoint and from a performance standpoint to try and meet that. Because then you're really mimicking real world movement, because you're doing it, like when you're at the sporting environment, or even if you're just walking through a busy part of the city, like you're doing an awful lot with your eyes, you're moving your head an awful lot, and the body should just follow suit. The body should be able to coordinate itself underneath all that load and that noise that's going on from the neck up. And so we really have to mimic those kind of strategies within a rehab setting and a performance setting, if we really want to prepare athletes for the chaos that occurs in real worlds and sporting environments.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to share with you a little bit about what our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, now has available in their store. You hear me mention in the outro of the show all the time about the Freelap timing system in the K-Box, which I have and use regularly. But today I wanted to share a little bit more about the bar speed monitoring units that SimplyFaster has, which is the GymAware and the new portable Flex unit. So let me start with the GymAware. I mention it regularly on the show. It's been referred to as the Cadillac of bar speed monitors. Carl Valley calls it a lab inside a lunchbox, as the readings you get out of the GymAware go well beyond typical concentric or just up phase of the lift velocities. Rather, you can measure the entire shape of the barbell lift in terms of eccentric velocity, range of motion, and total work done. Total work being awesome, by the way, especially like comparing a long-armed bench presser or a 6'10 squatter versus a 5'11 point guard. So you're getting all these extra metrics that you're not getting on other units. It's perfect for teams wanting to manage the weight room, and the data synchronizes to software platforms such as Coach Me Plus, Team Builder, and Athlete Monitoring. So new to the store is the Flex, which is the ultra-portable and lower-price travel version of the coach's favorite GymAware. So just like the GymAware, the Flex measures the shape of each rep, range of motion, total work done, eccentric dynamics. So for this and the gym aware, this is the advantage that a force plate would have over just knowing how high you jumped. You're getting many other metrics and information that go into this unit of work. Compared to similar portable bar speed monitors, this unit gets the entire rep rather than a fraction. So you have here two awesome tools. And if you're interested in upping your game in the velocity-based training and bar speed world, I would definitely recommend heading to the store at simplyfaster.com and checking into these two units. All right, let's get back to the show. Ryan, you mentioned using the hands, feet, and eyes in isometric training. And this is something I've talked with Dan briefly about before. But could you expand on that? Because I know the listeners, the audience, we've done a lot of shows on isometrics on this podcast particularly. I just did one that released yesterday with Dr. Mark Wetzel on the same thing. And so I know a lot of people are using them, be it for tendon health or the neurological benefits of the movement. Yeah. But so what are some examples of some ways that you would potentially enhance an isometric using the hands, feet, or eyes, or your instructions in that?
Yeah, sure. We definitely want to get as practical as we can today to give your listeners a lot of clinical kind of scenarios that they can use. So when it comes to isometrics, I think in very simplistic terms, isometrics really allow you to experience load in a safe and controlled manner while still being able to produce a lot of motor output. So it's a really nice way to start by reducing the noise to the nervous system, but by enabling it to experience load. And I think when you really step back and think about isometrics, what's most important to me about isometrics is where you're delivering that isometric load. Not about the actual time or the tempo early on, but where you're delivering it. So because a lot of us, when we jump off a treatment table, or if we're in a clinical environment or a performance environment, we typically all stand up on 2 feet and walk. And so anytime an athlete or a client comes to see me in my clinic, I really want to get an idea of how their nervous system is accepting load through their feet, no matter what they have. If they have a neck issue, headaches, anything. And so what I typically do is I kind of break out a few assessments to challenge each sensory system. And one of the things that I do is, it's kind of hard to describe now without actually doing it. So I'll get the individual in kind of like a gait-specific stance. Let's say I have them kind of in a stride stance with the right leg in front and the left leg behind. And I've got maybe like 70% through the right leg, 30% force through the left leg, with a little bit of a bend in the knee to try and get some co-contraction qualities in that right limb. And what I'll have them do then is I'll have them close their eyes, because when I have them close their eyes, I'm essentially seeing how does their nervous system trust the information coming from the peripheral tissues in that position, right? Obviously, you're getting some vestibular load as well there, but I'm really trying to see, does their brain actually trust the information coming only from the proprioceptive system? And if they do okay with that, then that's good. And then I'll have them maintain that position, but then I'll have them rotate their rib cage to the left, let's say. And so if my right leg's in front and I'm rotating my rib cage to the left, I'm lengthening certain peripheral tissues in that limb. So that's changing my physiology. Whenever I change position, that changes physiology, that changes how the nervous system is going to respond to information. So I'm loading up more medial tissues there. And then I'll get them into that position, and then I'll have them close their eyes then to see, does their nervous system actually trust the information while those peripheral tissues are being lengthened and loaded? Because that could change everything. Then they might experience a lot more sway, a lot more movement. So it gives me information about how the nervous system trusts that information. Then I'll have them rotate the other way into that end range and have them close the eyes. So I'm loading more the posterior lateral tissues throughout the whole lower limb and close the eyes. And almost all the time, I'll notice a difference there. I'll notice the difference between when the medial tissues are loaded versus the lateral tissues are loaded. And all that does for me is it helps guide where I want to deliver my load, my isometric load first. So if I find that when they rotate to the left, when they're loading more medial tissues, and they experience a lot more sway, a lot more instability in their movement, I know that there's not a lot of trust there between that receptor feedback to the brain. And so I know exactly where I want to deliver my isometric load, maybe in my manual therapy, to try and help redistribute the load through the whole limb. Okay, because that's going to affect everything that transmits up through the midline, up through the neck and everything. So even if I'm doing even any kind of like neck isometrics or upper limb isometrics, I'm having them engage that specific position where their nervous system potentially was perceiving some kind of threat through those tissues to help enable it to safely experience load there. Right? And even if it's with someone that has some kind of lower limb issues, then I know exactly where I'm doing my isometric loads first. Instead of just doing very, very generalized isometric loading, I know exactly where I'm doing it, where that athlete needs load first before I start to just annihilate them with stimulus. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. So is the closing... Can you remind me again what the closing of the eyes does? Are you having them close their eyes at a specific point, or are they having their eyes closed for the whole thing to be able to zero in on?
Yep.
Or how does? Can you explain that again?
Yeah. I'm looking for in specific positions there, because it's challenging to do, especially if you're moving with your eyes closed and you're rotating with your eyes closed. I just want to see how do they trust certain positions. So in each position that I engage, my nervous system has to ask itself, do I actually trust the information coming into my system in this position? So when I'm standing in a stride stance and my eyes are open, I rotate my rib cage to the left, I'm loading up certain peripheral tissues in my lower extremity, and then I close my eyes, and then I'm checking to see what happens there. Because in that moment, I'm not getting a lot of visual feedback. So then the reliance or the dependence shifts to now the brain has to focus only on the proprioceptive information and the vestibular system information too. So I can get an idea of like what peripheral tissues does my brain actually not trust being loaded? Because then I know that from an athletic standpoint, I want to get the nervous system to trust information from every peripheral tissue. Yeah. Because that's helped me redistribute the load throughout the entire over greater surface area, which is obviously going to have massive carryover into how long I can sustain performance and how much load output or motor output I can actually produce as an athlete. And I'll just use that from an assessment standpoint. And then what I'll do is I know exactly where to perform my manual therapy to just try and kickstart that load delivery, and then where I'm going to perform my isometrics. And then when I have that isometric load, I start to layer other things on top. That's when I start to layer visual work. That's when I start to layer vestibular work, because I'm getting very specific with where that nervous system, that unique nervous system needs load, without just trying to just throw isometrics at an individual without really understanding what they need. And that all comes back to really making your assessment and your interventions as unique as possible, because everyone has different past experiences, everyone has different past injury history, so you have to respect that when you're working with clients as well. And it's the same. You can do the same thing with the upper extremities as well. I think adding, like, if we want to talk about how you can add more kind of neural engagement to just a basic isometric, I do an awful lot of like dual tasking with isometrics, because typically as athletes and as individuals that move through the world, we don't just consciously bring our awareness into kind of a peripheral tissue in the body when we're moving, but that peripheral tissue should be able to do its job while I'm doing something else. And so I'll do an awful lot of like exhalation-based breathing. I'll do an awful lot of like spinal mobility work with breathing. I'll do an awful lot of visual work, vestibular work, just to add a bit more kind of cortical activity, a bit more cognitive load almost. And there's a good bit of research on how we can improve our response to painful stimuli and our ability to respond to unexpected perturbations when we train with a dual tasking manner as well, because it's almost like we're trying to make that isometric load a bit more automatic while I'm doing something else with the nervous system. So there's a bit more of a carryover into my kind of automatic kind of storage within the nervous system, so I can call upon load, safe load in that peripheral tissue in the real world without having to consciously think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. It reminds me of, I've seen Cal Dietz do videos on something he called neural perplexity that remind me of that exact same thing. Or there was something where, I think it was a study where some people were doing like a bike ergometer training system, and one group just did the program and the other group did it, the same program, but they had to solve math problems while they were riding the bike. And then at the end of the series, they saw who could have the most improvement in just riding the bike, just the training program. And it was the program that had the group that had the other things going on, because they they had their RPE was like their rate of perceived exertion was higher when they were actually training with the math problems than when they didn't have them. I don't know if that's the same thing. Maybe I'm just kind of going off into something else. But I did have a couple follow-up questions. But before I ask them, Kyle, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think the biggest gap that I see is exactly what Ryan said. Isometrics tend to be trained in such a conscious way, just focusing on the peripheral tissue. And that's just not how we move through the world. And if we're really trying to get the optimal carryover to performance specifically, there's not going to be any time where you're on the field that all those sensory systems aren't going to be having to work together. And then on top of that, you have to problem solve on the field as well, right? Like you're reacting to visual stimuli and having to actually have a cognitive load with it. So that's why dual tasking is great from one, just adding sensory stimulus as a whole, but the concept of dual task and having it be a little bit more coordinative or having extra layers to it outside of just, okay, let's have a gaze stability with just be staring at a point while you do this, right? Yes, that's adding visual load, but I think when you can think about it through more of that dual task lens and trying to engage multiple sensory systems and trying to increase the cognitive load as a whole, it can really start to improve your carryover elsewhere. I've just seen so much isometrics being, let's hold it there, let's hold it for a minute, and let's focus on contracting this muscle as much as we can. And let me tell you, that's better than a lot of other situations, but there's always ways to improve the carryover and improve the motor output that you're getting. If we just talked and said that the sensory systems are what really drive our motor output, why are we not engaging them when we're trying to get as much motor output as possible?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things I like as you guys are talking about this, something that pops into my head is LeBron standing on balance balls, having like throwing a couple basketballs or something that's, and it's a lot of people would look at that and be like, "Oh, that's dumb. It's not specific." I always just look at it. If the athlete is extremely good and they like something, there's probably a reason they like it. And, specific or not, balance, whatever you want to say about the whole thing, there's a lot of dual tasking and I guess neural perplexity there that's probably very good for his nervous system. What do you guys think about that? Or can you guys give me some more examples of dual tasking in your practice? So in the midst of an isometric or something that's like practical that we could kind of put in our pockets.
Yeah, well, I think speaking to the LeBron thing first, that's something that comes up all the time, especially when I'm training these high-level football guys. They're always wanting to do that type of stuff now, right? Because they see things on Instagram that, Antonio Brown has these flashing glasses on, right? He's standing on a single leg on a BOSU ball, and then he's catching 19 balls at once, right? I think the problem is not what you're doing with that, more so how you're using it in the programming, right? If you use that appropriately and then take all the stimulus and improvement you can get in the nervous system from that and immediately go do some sort of high motor output activity, whether it's heavy squats or a power or explosive type exercise, then I think that's where you can get the benefit out of it. I think a lot of that stuff gets lost in context in social media, and that's the biggest issue. So I think Ryan will agree. I don't have a problem with that. I just think it's misused sometimes in the programming.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. In terms of like more practical applications, it's, again, I keep coming back to it. It's really about understanding where the load is needed. So I think for a lot of like trainers, I do a lot of like cerebellar testing in my clinic, because the cerebellum is that part of the brain that has to integrate all the mechanoreceptor feedback from the body at any given time. And so the cerebellum is concerned with like coordination, with timing, with rhythm. And so when I'm testing someone's muscles, I want to get an idea of how that cerebellum is responding to that, to allow for good coordination, to allow for good timing and rhythm. So I'm not, when I'm testing someone, I'm not looking for the black and white. I'm not looking for strong versus weak, because that really offers me nothing about the individual's ability to respond to opposing force. I want to give the nervous system time to respond. So when I do like let's say a muscle test, I'm not testing one muscle, I'm testing directions, and I'm testing through multiple joints. So I'll typically test through the foot an awful lot, to see how well the force is being transmitted through the whole limb, and I look at different directions. And so if you're a coach and you can't do any kind of hands-on testing, I like to manipulate the Bunky test. You ever hear of the Bunky test?
I don't think so.
The Bunky test is a test for low capacity of certain lines, like force transmission lines through the lower limb especially, and up into the midline. So you could have someone on their back and you could have a step in front of the kind of lower extremity would be slightly extended with a little bit of a bend in the knee, and they're driving through the heel to try and lift the pelvis and the back off the floor and trying to hold it there for as long as they can, essentially. So you're getting an insight into how well that posterior chain is loading or accepting load through the extremity. And again, you have certain ranges for what's good and what's not good. But if you read, like, a lot of that stuff is done through the heel, but you don't push off your heel as an athlete to propel yourself forward. And so I do an awful lot of testing through the foot, right? Typically through around the midfoot, forefoot, to see how well force is being transmitted through the foot, up through the knee, up through the hamstring, into the hip, and to get an idea of how different directions play a role in movement. So I'll see if there's any difference in how I can respond to load through the anterior chain, the lateral, medial, posterior. And so typically what I find in clinic is that a lot of the time the posterior kinetic chain from the foot through the plantar fascia, up through the calf, up through the hamstring, into the glute, isn't able to coordinate movement well. I'm not saying it's not strong, but I'm saying it doesn't have it can't really respond to like incremental load, where like when you start very gently through the foot and you slowly build, they'll push down on the brakes or on the accelerator and like drive their foot down to the table. And because I think a lot of athletes kind of get the idea that strong is good and weak is bad, but that's not the case. I think a much better reflection of the state of an individual's neurology is how well they can relax versus how quickly they can kind of turn on muscles, you can say. And so I'll actually build up the tension through the foot while having the athlete press down to the table with a little bit of a knee bend to try and get that co-contraction capability into the leg as well. And hold it there for like 7 seconds and build up to 7 seconds. And I'll typically see an incredible amount of shaking in the leg, which gives me an insight that the nervous system is almost freaking out with that incremental load. And so I know that I then have to kind of start building better load tolerance through that part of the kinetic chain there. So I do this thing in clinic, which I don't know if it's massively used a lot. I do like what I call like walking perturbations, you can say, with the hands. So if I find an athlete that has poor kind of cerebellar output through the posterior kinetic chain in terms of it doesn't have good timing, good coordination, good rhythm, I'll get them into like a half kneeling posterior chain isometric. So I'll get them half kneeling. I'm just going to stimulate this so I can better explain it. So let's say I'm going to work through the right posterior chain. I'm kind of putting force through my left knee. I'll put a little step in front, like a 6-inch, 10-inch step in front, and I have my forefoot putting force down through that step with a little bit of a knee bend to try and get that coactivation capability through my foot, my calf, and my hamstring. And then I always think of like the Franz Bosch kind of approach here, where you want to have that kind of universal tractor. I want to build that load tolerance through that posterior kinetic chain, but I also want to leave a bit of room on the outside for self-organization, the fluctuation, right, in that movement. Because I know that I'm not going to just be propelling force through the posterior kinetic chain in a real-world movement. So what I'll have an athlete do is I'll have them kind of drive their forefoot down to the step and get the hamstrings, get the calves working together. And then I'll have them close the eyes and I'll have them walk their hands down the medial part of their lower extremity to add perturbations. Right, so I'm pressing on the medial part of the leg and I'm walking down all the way down to the forefoot. So again, we all know how much of a cortical map the hands have in the nervous system. Mm-hmm. So I'm really building better kind of cortical awareness of that, but I'm also kind of allowing for an internal perturbation to my own external force that I'm putting through the limb. And by closing my eyes, it means that I don't necessarily know when that hand is coming in contact with my leg, if that makes sense. If my eyes are open, I can expect that. So I'll just maintain the posterior direction of force. And then by walking my hands down the medial part of my limb, putting pressure through it, I'm asking the medial peripheral tissues to respond to that external load. And then I'll walk my hands down the lateral part of that limb down to my forefoot. So I'm getting nice length through the posterior chain under load through an isometric. With my eyes closed, I'm really forcing all the awareness on my proprioceptive system.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Speaking of the hands too, I posted I just kind of discovered this randomly the other day. I was doing a Nordic hamstring exercise, and I didn't even realize I was doing this till I was halfway through the exercise of the set, but I had naturally just put my hands on my my proximal hamstring attachments as I was going down, and I could go further, way further. And so
I saw that. Yeah.
How does that mechanism, like, what's the neurology behind something like that?
It's definitely it's quite complex. It's definitely not as simple as I'll make it seem now. But
it's an hour show.
When you think of the real estate attributed to the hands within your sensory cortex, the amount of representation granted to the hands is very, very large compared to any other part of your anatomy. And so your nervous system is going to pay attention to what your hands place themselves on, what part of your body you place your hands on. So it's almost like you're going to be bringing your conscious awareness to your hamstring. So there's a difference between subconscious awareness and conscious awareness. And so the cerebellum, the part of your brain that lives behind the brainstem, is always aware of every single part of your body at every single time. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to stand and do things without being aware of your ankles, where your ankles are. You're not consciously aware, but you have to have awareness there. And that's due to the mechanoreceptor feedback. But once you bring your hands in contact to something, or once you bring your thought into an area, you're layering conscious awareness on top of that subconscious awareness. So there's going to be a larger amount of sensory feedback from that body part. And if the brain has more sensory feedback from a body part, then as a result, it's going to feel a bit more safe, granting you a bit more motor output, a bit more tone and tension to achieve the task that you're trying to achieve, if that makes sense.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, for sure. I've noticed, especially with a lot of elite athletes that I work with, is if we're doing anything unilateral, if they have a free hand, a lot of times they'll utilize that free hand to improve sensory feedback in like a core region, like somewhere in the abdominals or ribs or something that they're trying to get a higher output, usually on medicine ball drills. But I never realized that at first, and then I realized that was something they were kind of doing automatically to improve feedback through. And like you guys said, the trunk is reflexive and it's not as intentional. So it seems as if you would need the help from the hands on the midline or the central structures of the body to help the reflexive action happen better.
Yeah, it's almost like you spoke about, like, athletes do these kind of weird things with the hands when they run, right? Again, it's basically kind of layering more sensory feedback on top of what you're doing already to get the brain's attention, right? So again, if you can stimulate or engage more parts of the nervous system, more parts of your anatomy, you're going to get the nervous system's attention a lot more. But you're also going to improve its ability to direct motor output, because if it's more consciously aware of the body, it's going to feel safer because it's going to have more information about where your body is in space. And that's the ultimate goal of your brain, is to know where you are in space, because it hides in a little black cave, and the only way it has access to the outside world is through your sensory systems. So again, sometimes the eyes aren't enough if they're moving around. So again, the athlete's going to start to engage the hands to kind of deliver a bit more kind of awareness or sensory feedback to give the brain that understanding of, hey, where are you relative to the rest of the body, relative to the gravity, and that safety is going to kind of lower the sympathetically driven behavior of the athlete, and perhaps improve the ability to direct motor output to the right tissues where your intentional focus is.
Yeah, I think it's something that is way more common than people think. They're just not looking for it. And it's a way that I use as an assessment. If you truly watch athletes, like you just said with your athletes during their med ball drills, they're not even knowing that they're putting their hands in certain areas many times. It's a way that I look for, where is the body looking for more information, right? It's a way that I can start to look at an athlete and say, this person keeps putting his hands here to accomplish this motor task. I probably need to drive more information there through whatever I'm doing, whether it's through sensory systems or through some of my load proprioceptive type stuff. But it can really help start to be more specific to the individual in front of you when you can start to notice some of that. Or if an athlete says, hey, I feel a lot better when I have my hands here, that can really give you an indication of where they need more stimulus. Because like Ryan said, the brain's always looking for more information. The more information it has, the safer it's going to feel, the better the motor output's going to be. But use that to drive your training based on what you see.
Yeah, it makes sense. The more you hear it, the more it makes sense. Like if the brain doesn't have sensory information about what it's going to do, it's not going to wire power to the movement because it's going to get hurt, or the body's going to get hurt. So for example, for me with my, if I'm needing more sensory information on my hamstrings, doing a Nordic hamstring type exercise, and it's tough because my hands, I have long arms. And so I have the advantage that I bet you there's a lot of athletes who with shorter arms than me who would have a hard time even reaching their hamstrings. But say you had someone in that situation, how are you going to advance that? So you have the information. I need more sensory information there. What are you guys doing with that outside of just me having my hands there? Is there other techniques or ideas that will improve the strength of that movement?
That's a good question, because I definitely wanted to get to that before we finished up. So the hands is one way to deliver that information. But if we come back to the vestibular system for a moment, the position of your head is a very important piece of information to your nervous system. And so whenever I turn my head in a certain direction or move my head in a certain direction, my brain is going to pick up that information, and through those reflexive pathways, there's going to be changes in tone throughout my body. Okay, so the proprioceptive system is, especially in upright stance and upright movement, is kind of typically set up to oppose the movements of my head. So let's say if I'm, like, you can think about it with just general walking. A lot of our neurosensory experience through the world is driven by forward motion. Okay, so we typically fall forward, we catch ourselves with our foot. We fall forward, we catch ourselves with our foot. And so in that moment, my head is traveling forward. So my vestibular system is telling my brain, hey, we're falling forward. So where do you think you're going to have to increase the tone and the awareness through? You're going to put it into your extensor muscles, into your glutes, into your kind of back extensors, say, right? But even lower down into the kind of down to the posterior chain as well, and sometimes into the anti-gravity muscles. It's very complex. You can't predict where it's going to go. But even if, let's say, if I was to fall forward and to the right, again, think about what muscles throughout the body have to oppose that force. You're thinking maybe if I'm falling forward to the right, the posterior lateral muscles on the left side of my body might have to increase in tone to prevent me from going that direction. Okay, so if I want to get some more tone or more awareness into a body part, I can typically kind of use the vestibular system to drive more tone into the body part that I want to get more awareness of. So I'll typically, well, you can kind of do it in many different ways. It depends on what you want to do, but sometimes you just have to step back and see how the vestibular system is functioning as a whole. So I'll do an awful lot of like vestibular ocular drills, which involve coordinated movements of the eyes, the head, and you can link it to the rest of the body depending on what kind of vestibular drill you do. So what I will do an awful lot of the time when I'm trying to get more kind of posterior chain activation, you can say, I will get the athlete set up into a kind of a stride stance, just like I mentioned before, and I'll have them hold a target directly out in front of them at arm's length and keep their eyes stabilized on that target. And what I'll do is I'll do what's called like a vestibular ocular reflex cancellation drill, which just adds a bit more kind of challenge to a head and eye movement. Because I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about the vestibular ocular reflex, which allows me to maintain my gaze stability on targets as my head moves, which is quite an important thing for an athlete because you don't want your eyes moving around with your head in a game situation. So I'll have them in that stride stance. I'll have them keep their eyes fixated on that target, and I'll have them link their arm, which is holding the target, the eyes and the head in a downward motion towards my pelvis, let's say, right? So I won't have any movement of my spine, yet I'll have just movement of the head down the way. Because in that moment, my the anterior canals and different parts of my vestibular system are picking up that movement of the head and saying, hey, we're falling forward, so you probably want to increase some tone into the extensor muscles right now. And then I can add more speed to that, but I can also add more body coordination to that. So then I'll actually integrate a reach with my shoulder to try and offload the extensors of different parts of my shoulder, which I won't get into right now, but it's definitely something that is good clinically for pain, especially, and gaining rib cage movement as well. I'll have them integrate the head, the eyes, the arm, and the spine. Then I'll have them moving down towards the knee with their target, okay, to add a bit more coordination. And then I'll have them reach even more and reach down towards the feet, whilst always integrating the eyes to maintain stability on the target. Head position is integrated too, because anytime I have to move my eyes and my head, the vestibular system essentially makes sure that your eyes can maintain stability on that target. Because if your vestibular system isn't communicating the head movement to your brain well, then the eyes aren't going to really be able to stabilize well, and that's through that vestibular ocular reflex. But basically, the head position can help to reflexively increase tone in certain parts of the body. So using the vestibular system as sort of like a neural primer before you do any kind of isometric drill in a certain area, or trying to achieve more motor output into a certain area without doing isometrics or without using your hands, can be really, really effective, because we know how influential the vestibular system is over the whole body, because when you get those vestibular issues, you're definitely going to feel it in the whole body. And when we talk from a clinical standpoint of vestibular issues, we're not talking about you're going to see things with the naked eye here. You have to tease out these subclinical asymmetries. So we might have to we have to cut off visual information if we want to know if there's a vestibular issue, because then we can isolate the vestibular system and how it controls movement. And so if there's a lot of swing or a deviation in movement with certain tests, we can step back and say, hey, this athlete needs some vestibular integration. And we talk an awful lot about that on our courses, our performance courses, and our approach courses as well, how to assess and understand where this athlete needs load and where they need to engage more. But you can use it from a clinical perspective to help someone in pain, but also to drive more tone into an area as an athlete if you want to increase motor output through an area as well, by understanding how the head movement integrates with the rest of the body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, on a basic level, I think it's similar to what Dr. Mark Wetzel said last podcast, the idea of just having your thumb in front of your eyes, and if you turn your head to the left and your eyes have to maintain contact on your thumb, like that would be the really purely basic version of that. And then, so you're basically using just versions of that before the isometric to improve the sensory load into the body, so they get a stronger output. Exactly.
So I mean, when you're talking about that vestibular ocular reflex, that's a reflex that should happen. But when you talk about the vestibular ocular reflex cancellation, where I have to link my eyes with my head motion now, that's going to be more of a cortical activation. So that's going to add a bit more kind of brain activation, you can say, to the actual movement. So you have to use more frontal cortex activation to override the reflex, which is a lot more kind of stimulatory to the nervous system.
That makes me think about, so I take everything back to pick up basketball because it's the best warm-up. and I think about when you're playing versus you're lifting weights, you're running, you're doing drills, your eyes always straight ahead, your head's straight ahead. Mm-hmm. There's neither of either. You know, you're not doing the vestibular ocular or the cancellation. You're just lifting. And so I always think, well, basketball, you're always moving. How could you play basketball and not move your head or your eyes, right? Exactly. And how much of a primer is that? And obviously, there's all the emotional things as well, but to every movement you're doing. And so I think, it's just another cool example to me of how it all works together.
Absolutely. And when you can layer the vestibular system with isometrics, I see some very, very cool changes with that, with clients with pain and with athletes with any kind of performance issue. And it's just as simple as stepping back, assessing where they need load. Does their vestibular system need to be able to accept load better? What side do they need it through? What part of the vestibular system they need it through? And then you can construct more specific, you can say neural primers, or you can integrate it into your sessions as well. But you have a really unique stimulation kind of approach for your athlete, your unique athlete, to do maybe in between sets during a session, before a session, but also to integrate it into their rehab program if they're suffering from any kind of like pain experience. anywhere in the body, or kind of little niggles here and there, because we want every peripheral tissue to be able to accept load well, and we want the sensory systems to be able to accept load as well. And we just want to marry that together, because neurology talks a lot about what goes on above the neck, and physiotherapy, performance-based stuff, we talk about what goes on below the neck. So let's marry the two together to try and build a really robust athlete that's very, very hard to stress and perturb.
Yeah, I love it. So just with a couple of minutes left, I did want to bring it back quickly. Something, Kyle, that you mentioned, which was the LeBron James stuff, right? But that not being from what I understand, like that's not a standalone training method that you should do. And obviously, the stuff you see on Instagram, there's a lot more to just blindly copying. That's really silly. But the idea of that being a primer, and so I think about. I even saw a guy, I've been trying to rack my brain for his name, actually, the last 30 minutes with the mental space I have, because I'm really disappointed I can't remember his name. But he's a guy who can dunk just as well at age 35, 36 as he probably could at 22. This guy is amazing. He gets his head over the rim and all this stuff. And I see he'll post training videos. And you see this at a lot of elite, just who are good athletes. I mean, granted, this guy's a powerhouse physically as it stands, but he's like doing, cleans on a Bosu ball or whatever. It's like, okay, whatever. Like, we know this is not, for what all the reasons are, but I'm like, you know what? This guy is challenging his nervous system. So he's probably getting something from a nervous system perspective out of this. And I've seen things where I saw a video where Paul Check was doing a bottoms up kettlebell press, a single arm bench press with his back on a physio ball. So a lot of balance. And he's like, he had said, when you do this, you could actually make your bench press afterwards better because of more neural drive. And so I just wanted to ask you any more about the idea of using some of these, I guess you could call them any drill that basically is frowned upon by modern exercise science, or doing a Bosu ball squat, anything like that. But the value of doing those types of things as a sensory piece before main work in training.
Yeah, I think one of the things I had said previously is that they're misused, one, in a programming side of things, but two, when you're doing all of that stuff at the same time, like you see with LeBron, like catching balls with flashing glasses on a Bosu ball, it's just not specific at all to any sensory system, right? One of the things that we try to do, especially with ICANN, like Ryan was just talking about, be specific with your assessments. Know what part of the vestibular system is going to activate the posterior chain and attack that with your neural priming drills, right? It's going to be way less effective to just throw everything at you to do this instability and just get the nervous system, as that's a very general word, right?
Yeah.
Working harder, when we could say, okay, we know what these systems do. We know what parts of the body they control. So let's assess those, see where this athlete has difficulty, give the body stimulus there. You're going to have much greater success actually changing the motor output, and changing the motor output on a long-term basis, right? These other things, you can do all kinds of neural tricks, right? And open up windows of strength changes for 30 seconds. But we want to truly assess where the athlete can't absorb load, right? If you think of load in the sensory systems the same way you're thinking of it as on the bar, right? If an athlete is really bad at pulling movements, but they're really good at pushing, what are you going to do? You're going to load up slowly and progressively those pulling movements to make sure they're balanced and accepting load everywhere. Same thing for the sensory systems. If they're driving and doing really well with their eyes, but when you test their vestibular system, they're having issues, that's probably where their body's going to look to get more stimulus, because it doesn't feel like it can accept load there. So when you can think of it through that lens, I think that's when you can start to get really powerful with doing some of these things before exercise to get the best motor output changes possible. And of course, you get more motor output, you're going to get more physiological changes. And that's what we're always trying to do, right? Use these neural things to actually change the physiology and mechanical structure of your muscles over time. But I think it's a matter of specificity more than anything else. Ryan, do you agree, or you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think it's all down to, like, when you think of neuroplasticity, like 30 seconds in a Bosu ball with the barbell on your back, catching things isn't really going to be enough. I think frequency is more important than intensity when it comes to trying to drive neural change. And so if you can empower the individual to do things themselves, not just in a clinical environment, but in many different environments, that's going to be much more a powerful change for any client, whether they're an athlete or not. You need to empower the individual. Simple things to do it frequently, do it with specificity, and then that'll open up a lot more kind of learning channels to self-organize towards something they want to achieve. You just have to make it a bit specific. That's what it's all about.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I think that's all the time I got for the show today. But so that was a lot of heavy but awesome information, and I know my knowledge of the I guess the nervous system, quote unquote, like all the parts of it, has definitely been elevated. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks for tuning in for another show. Appreciate you guys being here with us, listening across this diverse bandwidth of topics, and it's just so much fun to explore everything out there in the world of training and having more layers of the onion to go through and more lenses by which to see things that are going on in sport and athletics. If you enjoy the show, you can support us by giving us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to the show on. As always, our sponsor, simplyfaster.com. Be sure to check them out, support their website and what they are doing. And we will see you guys next week with another great guest. Have a good one.